Welcome to Empathy Stories, where every tale touches the heart. Today, we bring you the incredible story of Grace Thompson, a woman who uncovers a devastating betrayal by the person she trusted most, her own husband. Stay with us as we witness how she rises from the ashes of heartbreak to reclaim everything she's lost. It was a crisp morning in the heart of New York City. The hustle and bustle of life filled the air. Grace Harper, a successful woman in her mid-30s, walked into her favorite cafe, her usual spot on the corner of a busy street. Despite the luxury surrounding her, she felt a gnawing emptiness. The silence within her mansion, once a place of comfort, now felt like a void. Grace had everything money could buy: the mansion, the high-end wardrobe, the influential connections, yet happiness always seemed just out of reach. She still couldn't shake the unease that lingered inside, something she couldn't quite explain, but it was becoming impossible to ignore. Her life, outwardly perfect, had taken an unexpected turn since her parents' tragic accident 10 years ago. The accident had left her alone in the world, a woman burdened with responsibility beyond her years. Her marriage to Richard, a well-established businessman, had been a source of comfort initially. He was supportive, always present in her life, and slowly, he had taken charge of everything: the family business, the finances, even her decisions. It seemed right at the time. Grace had needed him. But as the years passed, something had shifted, something she couldn't place. She no longer felt like the woman in control of her life. As Grace took her seat at the counter and ordered her usual, a chill ran down her spine. There was a sense of familiarity in the cafe, a place where she was a regular, yet everything felt unfamiliar today. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her thoughts drifting to the events of the past few weeks. Despite the warm glow of the morning sun streaming through the cafe windows, Grace couldn't shake the dizziness that had become a constant companion. Nausea had taken hold of her, a strange and unnerving sensation that had been with her every morning for the past week. She brushed it off as stress, attributing it to her overwhelming work and responsibilities. It was then that she noticed him, a boy, no older than 12, sitting at the far end of the cafe. His clothes were torn, and his shoes worn thin from the life he had been forced to endure. His eyes, however, were sharp, alert, intelligent. He seemed out of place in a cafe that catered to the rich and well-heeled. Grace had seen him before, a fixture of the city's streets. But today, something was different. His eyes locked onto hers across the room, his gaze intense and unwavering. She looked away, uncomfortable, not knowing why the boy's stare felt so familiar, as if he could see straight into her soul. Without warning, the boy stood up and walked toward her table. Grace felt a sudden unease, but before she could say anything, the boy spoke. "Don't drink that," he said, his voice raspy, but filled with urgency. "Your husband put poison in it." The words hit Grace like a wave, freezing her in place. She blinked, thinking she must have misunderstood. The boy, with wide eyes, looked at her with a kind of knowing, like he had seen something terrible that she couldn't yet comprehend. His gaze was filled with fear, but also with a strange compassion. "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling, "don't drink it." For a moment, Grace stared at him, not knowing what to do. The unease that had been creeping through her veins for days intensified. Could this boy be telling the truth? Her eyes flitted to her coffee cup, the one she had been about to take a sip from. A strange thought flashed through her mind. The same cup, the same nausea she had felt for the past week. She chalked it up to stress or maybe a bad batch of coffee. But this felt different. Without thinking, she grabbed her purse and stood up quickly, leaving the cafe as fast as she could. Her heart raced as she walked out into the cool morning air, the words of the boy echoing in her mind. Was it possible? Could Richard, the man she had trusted, be capable of such betrayal? The boy's voice lingered in her ears as she left, his warning rattling her as she hurried down the street to her car. Grace wasn't sure what had just happened, but she knew one thing for certain. The illusion of a perfect life she had built around herself was crumbling, and she needed answers. Grace's hands trembled as she sat behind the wheel of her car, the cold steering wheel pressing against her palms. The boy's words haunted her thoughts as she drove back to her mansion. Was it possible? Was Richard, her husband of 5 years, capable of betraying her so cruelly? She couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. All she knew was that she needed answers. The mansion stood before her as she arrived, its grandiose exterior hiding the storm of emotions brewing inside her. She had trusted Richard with everything: her life, her family's fortune, the legacy of the company she had inherited after her parents' untimely death. But now, doubt lingered like a shadow over everything. The idea of betrayal seemed unfathomable. Richard was supposed to be her partner, the one who helped her rebuild when she lost everything. She had leaned on him when her world was falling apart, and he had been there, steady, supporting her through it all. But now, the thought of him possibly poisoning her, intentionally causing her harm, sent a chill through her bones. Grace took a deep breath and walked inside the house. Trying to steady herself, Richard was in his study, as always, buried in paperwork and meetings. His presence had always been a comfort to her, but now it felt suffocating. She moved through the house in silence, her footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. As she reached the study door, she paused, listening to the sound of Richard's voice on the phone. His words were muffled, but his tone was smooth and practiced, just as it had always been. But this time, there was something unsettling about it. She couldn't hear the details of the conversation, but she didn't need to. The cold pit in her stomach grew, and her breath hitched. In a moment of clarity, Grace knew she had to find out the truth. With cautious steps, she moved toward Richard's desk, carefully scanning the papers scattered across it. Her eyes fell on a set of documents she hadn't noticed before. They were hidden beneath a pile of other papers, almost as if someone had been trying to keep them out of sight. Without thinking, Grace grabbed them, her heart pounding as she examined the contents. What she found sent shockwaves through her body. The papers were a detailed list of financial transactions, bank accounts, and a set of legal documents that made her blood run cold. There were names and amounts, large sums of money, all funneled into offshore accounts that she had never heard of. But it wasn't just the money that shocked her. It was the note at the bottom of the last page. Transfer complete upon her death. The company and the estate will be mine. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the words over and over. The note, signed by Richard, confirmed everything. He had been planning to take everything from her. All these years, he had been secretly preparing to seize her family's fortune and her company. And the worst part was, it wasn't an accident. He had orchestrated her downfall. The poison, the illness she had been experiencing. It was all part of his plan to weaken her, to take control of everything she had built. Grace's mind raced. She had trusted him, leaned on him when she had no one else. And now, here she was, betrayed by the one person she thought she could rely on. She felt sick to her stomach. The life she had built, the trust she had in her marriage, had been a lie. Richard wasn't the man she thought he was. He was a calculating opportunist, a man willing to do whatever it took to get what he wanted. Her hands shook as she set the papers down, trying to process the information. How could she confront him? What would she do now? The mansion that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison, and she was trapped inside it, knowing that her life would never be the same again. But she couldn't let this go, not without a fight. Grace knew that she had to take control of her life again. She couldn't let Richard destroy everything she had worked for. It was time for her to make a plan to expose him, to take back what was hers. But first, she had to figure out what to do with the truth. And more importantly, what to do with the love and trust that had once been the foundation of her life. The air in the mansion felt heavier than ever as Grace paced back and forth in the living room, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her. Her hands still trembled from the shock of what she had learned, but a simmering resolve had begun to take root. She couldn't stay silent. She couldn't let Richard get away with what he had planned. This wasn't just about her. It was about her family, her legacy, and the years of hard work she had poured into building an empire that had been quietly slipping through her fingers. Grace paused in front of the grand mirror near the fireplace, her reflection staring back at her. The woman in the glass was familiar, yet different. The shock, the anger, the betrayal had stripped away the veneer of the polished wife and businesswoman. All that was left was a woman who had been played for a fool, a woman who had trusted someone who had used her vulnerabilities against her. But now, there was something more in her eyes: defiance, strength, and a fierce determination to take back control of her life. Without another moment of hesitation, she turned and made her way up the winding staircase to Richard's study. As she approached the door, she could hear the faint sound of his voice on the phone again, speaking in that same soothing, practiced tone that had once comforted her. Her stomach churned as she reached for the door handle, her breath shallow and uneven. Richard was talking to someone on the phone, but when he saw her enter, he quickly ended the call, flashing her a tight, forced smile. "Grace, love, you're up. How are you feeling today?" His tone was still gentle, still trying to maintain the facade of concern, but she could see the underlying tension in his posture, the subtle shift in his eyes. He knew she had found something. He knew the game was up. "I'm fine, Richard," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. She walked toward his desk, her eyes locking onto the stack of papers she had discovered earlier. She placed them down on the desk in front of him, the sound of them hitting the surface like a slap in the quiet room. Richard's face paled as he saw what she had in her hands, but he quickly regained his composure, leaning back in his chair with a controlled sigh. "Grace, I don't know what you think you found here, but you don't have to say another word." Grace interrupted, her voice unwavering. "I know exactly what's been going on. The offshore accounts, the plans to take control of everything after I'm gone. You thought I wouldn't find out, didn't you?" Richard's eyes darted around the room, and for the first time, Grace saw fear flicker in his gaze. But it was quickly replaced with a cold, calculating look. "You've got it all wrong, Grace. This isn't what you think." "Oh, it's exactly what I think," Grace said, her voice now tinged with quiet fury. "You've been poisoning me, haven't you? I was never sick. You've been making me sick. Also, you could take everything I've built. You had it all planned out, didn't you?" For a moment, Richard said nothing, his eyes narrowing as he watched her. And then, with a bitter chuckle, he leaned forward in his chair, his voice laced with venom. "You've always been too trusting, Grace. Too naive. I've been biding my time, playing the part of the loving husband, while all along I knew what I wanted. I could have had it all without you. But you were the perfect opportunity, weren't you? You were too easy to manipulate." Grace's heart shattered in that moment, not from shock, but from the cold, calculated cruelty in his words. She had been nothing more than a pawn in his grand scheme, a means to an end. The man she had loved, the man she had built her life with, had used her from the very beginning. "How long?" "Richard," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long did you plan this?" "Since the moment I met you," he admitted, his gaze unwavering. "Your parents' death was no accident. I knew exactly what I was doing when I wormed my way into your life. And once they were gone, I knew you'd be vulnerable. The company, the mansion, everything, eventually, it would all be mine." Grace felt the world tilt beneath her feet as she processed his words. Her parents' tragic death had been orchestrated, too. Richard had been involved in it all along. It had been a carefully crafted plan to steal everything from her: the company, her family's legacy, her future. Her voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief as she asked, "How could you? How could you live with yourself?" Richard's smile was dark, almost mocking. "How could I not? You were never more than a stepping stone. And now that I've secured everything, I'm done with you. It's over." "Grace." Grace's vision blurred with tears, but she didn't allow herself to cry. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She straightened her back, pulling the documents closer to her chest. "You may have won this battle, Richard, but I'll make sure the truth comes out. People will know what you've done. You won't get away with it." Richard's face twisted into a sneer. But Grace was no longer afraid of him. She was done being controlled. The chains he had wrapped around her heart and mind had been broken, and she knew it was time to rebuild her life. As she turned to leave the study, her heart heavy but determined, She knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer alone. She had the strength to fight back, and nothing, not even Richard's cruel betrayal, would stand in her way. Thank you for watching this powerful story of betrayal and strength. Grace's journey reminds us that even in the darkest moments, we have the power to take control of our destiny. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring tales. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.